Hi, my name is Maximilian Mozes, and in this video I will be talking about our work on worry, coping, and resignation, a repeated measure study on emotional responses after a year in the pandemic. This research project is part of a larger data collection effort, which can be divided into two phases. In phase one, in April 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, we collected emotional and textual responses to COVID-19. We presented the real-world worry dataset, which contains 5,000 long and short texts collected from 2,500 participants. So we asked each participant to write a long and a short text about their emotional states with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we asked each participant to provide ratings on a 9-point scale for 9 emotional variables, such as anger, happiness, and worry. And in phase 2, which is primarily what this research project is about, we asked ourselves how these individuals emotionally adjusted to the pandemic 1 year later. So we repeated the same data collection experiment. We conducted a repeated measure study in which we asked the same participants to again conduct the task. In this phase 2, instead of 2,500, we collected roughly 1,700 additional responses. And then given the two datasets, so the dataset for phase 1 and the dataset for phase 2, we were able to compare the emotional responses with respect to these two phases. In order to do this, the first thing we did was comparing emotional responses. So in the table on the right-hand side here, you can see the 9 emotional variables that we were interested in. And then there are two columns, phase 1 and phase 2, in which we can see the mean and standard deviation rating for each of those 9 emotional variables. And we also have a difference column where we can see the difference in, the change in emotional responses between the two phases. From this table, what we observe is that there's an increase in positive emotions, which means that the participants in phase 2 scored higher on desire, relaxation, and happiness as compared to phase 1. Whereas at the same time, we can see a decrease in negative emotions. So the participants scored lower on negative emotions such as anger, anxiety, and worry. After that, we were interested in the differences in emotion change between the individuals. So in order to do this, we conducted a k-means clustering on the 9 emotional variables. So we wanted to potentially identify individual clusters with respect to the emotion change. And we identified that a model with k equal to 2 clusters most suitably describes our data, which means that there are 2 distinct clusters that we identified in our data. One we call well coping and the other one we call resignation cluster. And the reason for this is shown here in the table. So in the table you can see the mean and standard deviation emotion changes for each of the 2 clusters. And cluster 1, the well coping one, we observe that the members of this cluster have an increased happiness score, an increased relaxation score, and an increased desire score, and at the same time negative emotions such as anger, anxiety, and disgust decreased. And on the other hand, for cluster 2, which we call the resignation cluster, we observed that certain negative emotions such as anger and disgust increased. But on the other hand, other negative emotions such as worry and fear decreased. And then thirdly, we were interested in analyses with respect to the differences in word usage between the two phases. We did a series of experiments here, and an example of this is the comparison of n-gram differences between the two phases. So we compared the n-gram frequencies in the textual responses for the two phases, and here in this table you can see on the left-hand side the top 5 most increasingly used n-grams in phase 2 as compared to phase 1, and on the right-hand side you can see the most highly decreasing n-grams in phase 2 with respect to phase 1. And here we observe that the most increasing n-grams relate to the vaccine, whereas the most decreasing ones relate to the news, workers, and worries. So to quickly conclude, this research project focuses on a repeated measure study on emotional and textual responses to COVID-19. We identified that individuals show an increase in positive emotional response and a decrease in negative ones. We also identified a heterogeneous pattern for the changes in emotional response to COVID-19 by identifying these 2 clusters, the well coping and the resignation one. And we observed that linguistic analyses reveal a focus shift from the first to the second phase. Our paper and full analysis is available on the archive preprint server, which you can find here under this link. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.